Now recording's in progress. So let me start that again. Anything that bubbled up or percolated in you, or something you'd like to follow up on from our time last week? We talked a lot about the parables, particularly the parable of the mustard seed and the parable of the sower. I did leave you with a question last time, which was, we talked a lot about the soil, about being good soil and receptive soil last time when we were talking about the parable of the sower. But I asked you to ponder what it meant that the name of the parable was the parable of the sower. So what does that, when you read that parable, what does it say about the sower? Anybody have a thought about that? Yeah, Tim, go ahead.
Well, I thought there was a lot of commentary on us receiving the parables, but when I think of the sower, it's us going out into the world and acknowledging that all of our pearls of wisdom, if you may, aren't going to be on great soil. that you should know that you're going to be casting your pearls amongst swine sometimes, and maybe refrain from that. But I kind of think that I'm not an evangelist, but I kind of have that Micah 6 thing where I try to seek out justice and love steadfastly and have a humble walk with my God, and knowing that my life may touch some in good ways and others it's just maybe not the right soil. So I kind of think of myself as the sower instead of being the receptor of it.
Yeah, that's a good word. I appreciate that. Your comment makes me kind of think of the Mother Teresa prayer, which, or something that goes something along the lines, I'm going to butcher it, but it's something along the lines of, you may be, when you do kindness and are generous, you might be trampled on. Be kind and generous anyway. Has anyone ever heard or read that poem by Mother Teresa? It's, when you're honest, people may try to deceive you. Be honest anyway, kind of thing. And that's kind of what I heard, Tim, a little bit in what you said. That's a good word. Anybody else, when pondering the sower in the parable, what is it? If the sower is God, what does that say about God? And the tosser of the seeds, what does that say about who our God is, if God is potentially the sower in the parable? Fritz?
Yeah, it says to me that God will give everybody a chance, that he's not just going to sow stuff where he knows it's going to grow. He's going to give everybody a chance to have it grow. Some will, some won't. Sort of what Tim said, our good works may help some people and may go unnoticed and or not help others. But God was not selective in where he was sowing the seed.
Yeah. Does anyone know the word prodigious? What prodigious means? It's where we get the word prodigal, right? And the parable of the prodigal son isn't in Mark, but the closest thing we got in the Gospel of Mark to a prodigious God is kind of in the sower. So prodigious is wasteful or extravagant. It's there's often been a case that we should rename the parable of the prodigal son to the parable of the prodigal father, because the father's grace and love for his sons in that parable of the prodigal son is wasteful and extravagant and abundant, and that's kind of what the sower does, right? The sower just tosses seeds. It doesn't really kind of look to see where the seeds are landing. It's just sort of waste. It's not good agricultural, policy or technique. It's this idea of like, I'm just going to throw it out and let's see where it happens. Let's see what happens with it. And that's kind of part of what the parable is kind of saying to us. Any other comments or thoughts about that? If not, we'll jump into the rest of we'll jump into chapter 5, which will put us about a third of the way through the Gospel of Mark. I hope you're realizing how fast we're kind of making our way through this gospel. It's such a quick gospel. Any other comments about chapter 4 before we move on? Okay. Well, yeah.
I did have a comment about the parable. Could he be predicting, or predicting, is that the word? When the disciples, after he's gone, when the disciples are going to go out and start spreading the word, what the experiences they might have?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at the parable. Was that Janet?
Yes.
Yeah. That was, I think that's a great way of looking at it. Yeah. It could be foreshadow. I think maybe the word you're looking for is foreshadowing.
Foreshadow, yeah.
Yeah, it's foreshadowing what the disciples will do, and foreshadowing what the church will do, right? Even our ministry doesn't necessarily always fall on good soil or produce the fruits that we or reap the rewards that we want it to, but we keep trying, and we keep working at it, and we do so with faith. And if God is the sower in the parable, it's a good example of you keep trying, you keep doing, and you just keep working at it. So thanks, Janet. I think that's a really good word as well. Again, I'll just end this part of this parables. We'll read a few more parables in a couple of chapters, but I'll just say this again. Parables are meant to be reinterpreted time and time again. The ideas that we have with them when we encounter them today might be different later on, and so that's the beauty of the parable, is you can always go back to them and glean even more meaning depending on where you are in your life. So let's jump ahead. Again, just kind of giving you a sense of where we're going to be today. We're still up in that northern part of around the Sea of Galilee. We're crossing over. I think we ended chapter 4 with crossing over to right south of Bethsaida, Julius, and then we'll even be a little bit lower than that as we get into the Decapolis, as Jesus kind of spends some time in non-Jewish territory. And that'll be really important to understand in this very next story, that he is not among his kindred when he comes into the situation with the man who is possessed by a legion of demons or unclean spirits. And there's a little bit of humor, dark humor, I would say, but still a little bit of humor in this story about the legion of unclean spirits and the pigs that we'll talk about here in just a second. But again, just to kind of where we ended last time, Jesus calms the storm, and they cross over to the other side. And we mentioned that the storm may be an allegory for a life of faith, that we often feel whipped about by life, that we can feel that we're not in control of the storm. And yet Jesus comes to us in that moment to kind of give us a peace that will allow us to reside even within the storm. And many of you shared how that has happened in your own experiences in life, where you've kind of felt tossed about by the storm, and Jesus came to you. But we end that with the disciples, being filled with awe at Jesus being able to command the storms, which again is kind of an echo to Genesis 1, where God begins to create by calming the chaos of the waters, therefore being able to separate it out and bring forth life. Jesus also is calming the storm so that he can bring about a kind of a newness of life, or a fulfillment of life, if you will. And his disciples are quite perplexed and awed by what he has done, but still somewhat clueless, which is one of the trademarks of the Gospel of Mark, is that until the end, the disciples are pretty clueless about what's going on with Jesus. So Again, I always a great way to look at the chapter, look at any chapter in the Gospels is to track what Jesus does, right? And it's kind of like your bold face studying habits, just being aware of what Jesus's actions are in each chapter. And so again, he crosses over to the other side. He meets a man in bondage. He chats with an unclean spirit. He casts out that unclean spirit into the pigs. He gets kicked out of town, which is not the first time or the last time he'll get kicked out of a town. He goes down to the Decapolis, which is Gentile territory. He agrees to heal Jairus's daughter. He heals a woman by power going out of him. He raises up Jairus's daughter, tells them to take care of her, and commands them not to tell anyone. And so if you were going to just kind of chart out the verbs and the actions in chapter 5, this is kind of what you would kind of come up with. Again, it's just a good way to kind of have an overall view of the chapter, and helps you to kind of start to piece together some similarities and some commonalities across the different chapters, because even a short gospel like Mark can sometimes get overwhelming. So if I was going to tell you what I think chapter 5, the themes of chapter 5 are, I think number one, it would be loosening and restoring, is that you just have some incredibly powerful stories in the 5th chapter of Mark, of Jesus loosening people from what is confining them and binding them or oppressing them, and then restoring them to their community. I want to stop right there real quick. So one of the things that, I'm constantly trying to remind folks of is Jesus very much understood in his ministry that community was essential. And that, Jesus doesn't say this, but my own shorthand for it is Jesus did not believe in the myth of the lone wolf. Jesus understood that without the pack, the wolf dies. And the wolf needs the pack to survive. And humanity, true humanity, is fulfilled in community, whether that's a small community of a family, whether that's a larger community of a neighborhood, whether that's a much bigger community like a church or a city or a state or a nation or a world, that we are not islands unto ourselves. And Jesus very much understood that the individualistic tint of Christianity that American Christianity really in the last 200 years has emphasized is really not at the heart of the gospel. And chapter 5 cannot illustrate that more clearly. That Jesus encounters 3 people in the gospel in the 5th chapter of Mark. All 3 of them are isolated. All 3 of them are incredibly pained, and their marginalization and their isolation is tormenting them. And Jesus loosens them from that isolation and restores them to the fullness of their humanity by reintegrating them into community. And so community, if you're familiar with Buddhist teaching, you will know that the Buddha commands his Buddhist disciples to always go to the Sangha and be part of the community. It's an essential teaching of Buddhism. It's also an essential teaching of Christianity, to be integrated into community. And chapter 5 really gets to the heart of that. So I just wanted to share that with you real quick before we give a little bit more, offer some time to share some reflections. So the man that we encounter, he is literally bound, right? He is enchained, and Jesus breaks his chains, and then restores him to his community. We'll look at that story in just a little bit more detail here in a second. Then he encounters a woman who is bound up by her ailment, by her blood ailment, which isolates her, marginalizes her from her community. Then by healing her, he restores her to the fullness of her rightful place within the community, and something that for many years she was unable to be a part of. And then lastly, he meets Jairus's daughter, and he loosens her from the bondage of death, and he restores her to her community, in this case her family. And so each time that Jesus heals somebody, or casts out a demon or does a miracle, it's not just the healing of the individual in that moment, but it's also the restoration of that person within their larger society. Because again, Jesus sort of understands that, like, we're not islands. We really are meant to live, with one another. I shared this with you last time, how the story of Mark 5 was seen as, has been one of the more favorite stories in the New Testament to get the allegorical treatment. And I shared with you two of them from last week, where the story of Legion in Mark 5 has been interpreted allegorically over the years. In the first and second century, there are church writers, church patriarchs, church leaders who very much see the story of Legion as an allegory for the Christian struggle against Rome, and even to the point where there's kind of a tongue-in-cheek aspect of the unclean spirits being called Legion, which is literally the name of the Roman garrisons, and the elite fighting force of Rome. And so so that was one of the allegorical readings of this story in Mark 5 in the first and second century. And then last week I shared with you that here in the 20th and 21st century, Mark 5 has become an allegory or a parable for the struggle of mental health, and how that can isolate a person and make them feel bound, and oppressed. And that Jesus is working very hard to free a person from a person's mental health and emotional health struggles. There is very much kind of a parallel between the man being chained in the graveyard to someone who has been hospitalized and for their own good, for their own safety, have been bound up so they can't harm themselves or someone else. And so a lot of mental health experts and mental health practitioners have read into Mark 5 an allegory about mental health, which just kind of tells you how, depending on where you are in life and where you are in your circumstances, the Bible can really kind of be seen in a lot of different ways. So the reasons why this man is ostracized, and so it is, and he's been taken out of the community, is when they come to him in chapter 5 verse 3. The man, he lives among the tombs, and no one could restrain him even so with the chain, for so often he had been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he'd wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. And so he, and night and day among the tombs on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. And so you get the sense that his community really cares for him, because he's doing self-harm. He's hurting himself so often with his thrashing about, with his actions, that you really do get the sense that the community is is not doing this to punish him, but because they're at their wits' end with him, and they don't want to see him get hurt any further. And so their solution is to isolate him and to bind him to something solid so that he can't move anymore. And so a lot of times the townspeople, I feel, get a bad rap, and that their actions are seen as malicious. But I think there is a case to be made that though their actions are not healing and are not kind, there is an essence to it of they're trying the best they can with what they have to do. And so Jesus comes up to this man, and immediately, we talked about this in the Gospel of Mark, that outsiders immediately recognize Jesus for who he is. And you cannot get more outsider than an unclean spirit. That is as far out from the righteous as you can possibly get. And the most of the outsidery of the most outsidery of an outsider immediately recognizes who Jesus is. Jesus, Son of the God Most High. I adjure you by God, do not torment me. Another translation of that is do not hurt me. Because that Greek word there that gets translated into English as torment is the same Greek word that in other places get translated as hurt or harm. Do not hurt me, do not harm me. It's a plea. It's a plea it's a plea for the unclean spirit's life, right? Like, don't harm me, don't hurt me, don't torment me. And Jesus, you'll notice Jesus doesn't strike him. Jesus doesn't manhandle him. Jesus doesn't do sort of a Herculean sort of thing and wrestle him, and subdue him. The next thing that Jesus does to the unclean spirit is what?
He tells the unclean spirit to leave him.
Asks what his name is, and to come out.
Right. Oh wait, but you guys are talking, but narrow. I mean, make it even more simple than that. What does Jesus do with this man, this demon? How does Jesus interact with him?
Asks him his name.
Right. So what does that mean, Pam? He talks with him.
Yes, he's trying to get to him on a personal level.
Yes, that's exactly what I was trying to get at. Thank you.
Community.
Yeah, Jesus immediately tries to build a rapport with this person. Any of us who have any background working with folks who are struggling with mental, emotional, or spiritual torment, asking them their name is a way to ground them and center them. And it's a way to make connection with them. It immediately humanizes them. I cannot tell you enough how many times that someone has come in asking for assistance on their last, truly hanging by their last rope, and just asking them what their name is. Immediately they smile. Immediately their shoulders just get a little squarer. They stand up a little bit straighter. It's a small technique, but it's such a powerful way to connect. And so Jesus is connecting with the demon. He does the exact opposite of tormenting or hurting or harming him. He tries to connect with him, which is such a peaceful way of dealing with, if you want to look at it, as an adversary in some ways. The demon replies, not the man, the demon replies, or the unclean spirit replies, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him, he being the unclean spirit, begged Jesus earnestly not to send them out of the country. And this is where it gets kind of funny, is Jesus then sees pigs and says, "All right, I'll send you, I want you out of this guy, but I'll put you in the pigs." Why would Jesus feel like that is an okay place to put the demons or put the unclean spirits?
Because the pigs are unclean.
Because the pigs are unclean. By whose definition are the pigs unclean, Gloria?
The community?
No,
I don't know.
The Jews.
The Jews.
Oh, yes,
Jesus is Jewish. So pigs are already unclean.
that's right.
But is Jesus in Jewish territory?
No.
No.
No. Which means that those folks who peddle in swine herds did not find their pigs to be unclean. They found them to be a very valuable source of their economic prosperity.
Mhm.
And so there is a little bit of humor here, right? There's a
Mhm.
cultural misunderstanding that goes on. Even messiahs have blind spots. And for Jesus, the blind spot was pigs are unclean. So Jesus puts the unclean spirits in the unclean pigs, and the pigs are so tormented by this experience that the pigs like jump into the ocean or jump into the sea. Now, I mentioned last week that there is a mythology, an ancient Jewish mythology, that the sea is chaotic, and it was the source of spirits. And that many unclean spirits were birthed and came out of the sea. So there is a way to interpret this story that Jesus sends the unclean spirits home, and that Jesus acts so peacefully with the unclean spirits, first trying to engage them, then healing the man so that he can have his full humanity back. But then Jesus doesn't kill the unclean spirits or destroy the unclean spirits, but he sends them home. Which I feel like is so much in like the line of Jesus. That just seems so much more Jesus-y than to me than the idea that Jesus vanquished the demons or the unclean spirits. That even his adversaries, Jesus has a heart of compassion and mercy for them. So, but then we get, then the people saw what happened, and they came to Jesus and saw the man sitting there, and they saw that happened, and to the swine, and they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. So like they don't want any more of their economic like livelihoods like being challenged and upended by Jesus, and so they ask him to leave, and he very kindly leaves. So then he moves on down to the Decapolis. But before we move on to the next story, which is a very powerful story about healing of the two daughters, any other comments about?
I guess my interpretation was a little bit different when I was looking at how Jesus said, come out of this man, you impure spirit. And then when they went, he gave them permission, the demon spirits, to go to the pigs. Well, then, of course, they have chaos and they jump into the lake. But were the demon spirits, did Jesus have control of them? Because it's like, or did they just like cause the pigs to go down there to have financial burden on the community, and then they went someplace else, like the demon spirits overtook other people somewhere else? I'm a little confused on where they do those spirits actually die in the lake? That's where I was kind of lost.
Sure, that's a great question, Sherry. So the idea is that I think the traditional interpretation of the story is that Jesus removes the demons from the man. They go into the pigs. The pigs, with their pig brains, can't deal with the unclean spirits being in them. They go mad, for lack of a better term, and in their madness, they run into the lake. The demons or the unclean spirits don't leave the pigs and infect the other people of the town. They perish with the pigs in the lake.
Oh, good. So that's 2,000 more demons that are gone out of our earth. That's
right. That's one way. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is, the townspeople have 2,000 less pigs.
Well, that's the financial burden of it all. Yeah.
Right.
Why
Okay.
pigs? Why pigs? Why not some other kind of animal?
Well, I think one, because it's a non-Jewish community, Carol, they could actually have swine herds, they could have pig herds, whereas the Jews would never have pig herds. They'd have lambs or sheep or something like that. So I think I think one, it's supposed to be a story about multiculturalism, two cultures kind of colliding and not understanding each other. But two, I think it's very important, like we said before, the pigs are unclean in Jewish eyes as well as are the unclean spirits. But I don't know.
But they eat everything.
Right, they are very smart. They are, and can be somewhat ornery from my experience with them. That's a great question. Fritz, did I see your hand?
Quick question, if I can ask it.
Yeah.
Go
Am I
ahead.
being heard?
Yes, go ahead, Gary.
In verse 13, is the word rushed down, that the swine rushed down to the water, or are there other words used in other versions?
Let me grab one more translation. I'll let you know. I'll look that up. And Fritz, what's your question or comment?
Well, what struck me was that, you know, they told him to leave town. And, you know, it's sort of like we do, you know, we find ways to ostracize people that we're scared of, or we don't understand, or that are different from us. And I can imagine that, you know, when people believing in shamans and spirits and so forth and so on, saw him, that he could be dangerous. If you can send pigs into the water, what can you do to me?
Yeah.
Yep. No, I think you're absolutely right, Fritz. I think that's another layer to it, right? If he has the power to do this, he might use his power for ill, right?
Right.
And in their eyes, he is using his power for ill, because he just wrecked their economy. Gary, it is rushed. I looked up two different.
I have a different thing. It says ran violently down a steep place into the sea.
Ran violently. Okay, I'd have to. That's an interesting one. But yeah, the idea is they were definitely in a hurry to do it, for sure. Yeah. Why do you ask, sir?
That's exactly the idea that backs up what you were saying about going home. They rushed. They were in a hurry. They want to get out of here, go home.
Yeah. Well, right. I find it very compelling. It seems like the most Jesus-y way to interpret the story, that Jesus was trying to act peacefully and be holistic to everyone involved. But other people like the idea that it was a little bit less. It was something else, but that's my favorite interpretation, Gary.
Yeah.
My question is, why in this story with the man does he say go home and tell everyone what happened? With the others, he said, don't tell anyone.
Yeah.
That's my question too.
Does anyone have an answer to it?
Is it he's trying to define mercy in terms of people have mercy on this type of person? Or what is he trying to tell us here?
I think that's a great way of looking at it, that Jesus is saying that. I think that's a great way of looking at it. I think there might be another level to it. I want to see if somebody else might see it before I give the traditional answer to that. Kelly?
Yeah, I read in my NIV study Bible, in the notes said that he was actually trying to protect himself from future more interactions and being overwhelmed even further by more people.
Mm-hmm.
He was trying to keep it a little more manageable.
Right. Oh, why he asked people to be quiet?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. And do you have a why this time he said no, go and tell?
No.
Okay. Does anyone have a thought?
No.
Okay.
Is it a Jewish Gentile thing, Darryl?
It is. Yes, Tim. The traditional answer, Pat, is exactly what Tim just said. Is in Jewish territory where there was a messianic expectation that the Messiah was coming, Jesus is don't tell anyone, because exactly what Kelly is saying, I don't want this getting out of control. Because there's already a messianic fervor in Jewish society due to Roman occupation. Now he's in Gentile territory, and I think he doesn't have the he doesn't have the same expectations on him, and in many ways they might not even know who he is. But two, this is an opportunity for him to kind of show, kind of the grace and mercy of God, right? In a society that doesn't believe necessarily in the same God that Jesus, worships and Jesus's people worship. So it is kind of, the traditional answer is that it's a Gentile Jew thing, and that in Jewish territories it's be quiet, but in Gentile territories it's like go and tell your friends. So it's a little different. Yeah, that's exactly right. Thanks, Tim. So I want to share a little bit more now, go on to the next story, because it's one of the best, in my opinion, in all of the Gospels, which is Mark 5:23 through 21 through 43. And so what you have in a very, a lot of times in Mark, things happen in such short verses. Chapter 5, you have two very long stories. In the story of the man possessed by Legion, and then this story. What you have is two stories. You have a story within a story. You get it's the most narrative and novelistic story, I think, in all of the Gospel of Mark. And it is, you have the introduction of Jairus. Then you have Jesus on his way to help Jairus and Jairus's daughter, where then he is interrupted, and he helps this woman who has had a blood ailment, and then we pick back up the Jairus story. That's a very un-Markian way of telling a story. Mark is very linear, and so this shows sort of an outside of the box kind of way for Mark to write the story, which is one reason why many scholars will tell you that Mark actually didn't write this part of the story, that he kind of cut and pasted it from other resources that he had available to him, because it just seems so unlike Mark to tell a story this way. But you have two, here are some of the similarities between the two stories. One is, notice the word daughter. We have Jairus's daughter, and then the name that Jesus calls the woman that he heals, he calls her daughter. Doesn't call her sister, doesn't call her another name, but he calls her daughter. And so, be thinking about that. That's I don't think that's a coincidence that the word daughter gets used in both stories. Jesus is touched or touches two incredibly unclean people in Jesus's world. So notice Jesus comes back over to, now we find Jesus back in Jewish community in these two stories. Therefore, he is encountering two ritualistically unclean people. If you read through particularly the second half of Exodus all the way through Leviticus and Numbers, you can find the Jewish commandments around blood ailments and how that makes a woman ritualistically unclean, and then how anyone who comes into contact with her therefore also becomes ritualistically unclean. Death is 100% unclean, and so by touching a dead person, Jesus again becomes unclean. So he's doubly unclean in this story. He first is touched by the woman with a blood ailment, making himself ritualistically unclean. He does nothing about that. He does not seem too worried about being made unclean. And then he goes and he touches a young girl who has died, which would make him unclean again. So he's doubly unclean. He gets a double dose of uncleanliness. And at no point does he go through the rites, the rituals, and the process to make himself ritualistically clean again. We don't even see him wash his hands, to tell you the truth, but we won't raise that point. And then both of them are kind of raised up. When the woman comes into contact with Jesus, she is literally groveling and crawling on the ground. And Jesus, by her being healed, she gets up and goes. She is reanimated. She is resurrected. She is raised up. Same thing with the young girl. It actually says in her part of the story, Jesus says basically, get up, rise up, be resurrected, and she immediately does so and begins walking about. So again, both of them get up and go, and so they are re-energized, reanimated in that way, whereas they had been horizontal when Jesus encounters them. They become vertical and animated once they become into contact and have this experience with Jesus. The other thing I want you to be very aware of is the gospel account refers to Jairus as a leader of the synagogue. If you are not aware who that is a Pharisee. Why it does not say Jairus the Pharisee, I have no idea. But a leader, that is exactly who a leader of a synagogue is. So notice that Jesus, and I say this all the time, Jesus, his rivals were the Pharisees. They had a nice rivalry going. They could not help but irk each other and poke each other and get under each other's nerves. And yet, even in their difference, even in their rivalry, that does not prevent Jesus from helping Jairus. He, as Dr. King said, it's always right. It's always the right time to do the right thing. And Jesus very much felt like the right thing to do was to help Jairus, his family, and help Jairus's daughter. And so he doesn't let his rivalry with the Pharisees get in his way of doing that. So that puts us into chapter 6. This is, like I said, this is one of the most powerful stories in all of the gospel. One of the ways in which this story was really brought to life for me once was I was leading in seminary. I was leading Bible study at the Samaritan House, which was a home for men living and dying with HIV and AIDS. And we were, it was Lent, to tell you the truth. And I was just doing a Lenten Bible study there. And we got to the story of the woman with the blood ailment, and hearing those men share their profound experience with Jesus, not being afraid to touch this woman with a blood disease. We're talking about the early 2000s, when very much AIDS was incredibly stigmatized, and people were very scared to embrace and hold the hand of and touch and put your hand hand on their shoulder. They were incredibly moved by Jesus's willingness to be in contact with this woman with a blood disease. So that always spoke to me. So if you jump into chapter 5, verse 38, you get a good glimpse of Jewish funeral. I should say this: Jewish funeral ritual for someone of wealth. Let me put it that way. Not everybody got this, but if you had some means, if you were affluent, then you could afford to pay for some wailers, right? You would pay for folks to come to your home to wail and to sing and to mourn, on the behalf of your loved one. So that it's an example of Jairus's wealth and place in society, in the community, that when Jesus arrives at his house, there would have already been a cadre of women there to publicly mourn and grieve the loss of the child. And so you get that. And then when you get into the actual house, and Jesus goes over to the child, he is surrounded by her family, because he allows the father and the mother, he allows Jairus and his wife to come in with him. And then you get a little bit of Aramaic. So he took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum. For whatever reason, Mark did not translate the words from Aramaic into Greek, but left the original Aramaic in the story. So you actually get a glimpse of Jesus's own words in terms of Talitha cum, which is "girl, get up." But you should know that those words "get up." Does anyone have any other word, any other translation for "get up" in chapter 5, verse 41? Okay, so those Greek words right there, and little girl, get up, are the same words that we'll experience in chapter 16 of Mark around the resurrection. And so they're the same, the exact same Greek words. That could easily be translated into English: little girl, rise up, or little girl, resurrect. And so we get a little foreshadow of an Easter event, very much like in the Gospel of John, the raising of Lazarus is a foreshadow of the Easter event. There is no raising of Lazarus in the Gospel of Mark. This is what we get. And you have seen these words before in chapter 2, in terms of the young man who was paralyzed. Jesus says, get up, take your mat, and go home. And which, again, those words "get up" could have been rise or resurrect. Those are all this. It's the same Greek word. And so, like I said, we'll see that again in chapter 16. So Jesus's ministry was, again, about raising people up to their full humanity, restoring them. And then it's 8 o'clock. And so I'll leave this with you, and we'll start with chapter 6 next week. One last thing. What is Jesus's, besides telling people not to do anything, what is Jesus's number one concern for this little girl? He tells them something to do with this little girl. What does he do?
Give her some food.
Give her some food.
Feed her.
Yeah. So take care of her.
Mhm.
That's basically what he's telling them, is look at this girl's hungry. Get her some food. This girl's thirsty. Get her some water. Take care of her. Take care of her immediate needs. She's gone through something, right? So she's gone through an ordeal, and now she needs to be tended to and taken care of. So again, there's this act of compassion. Jesus isn't out there going like, look at me, like, and stuff. He's very much saying like, no, the focus needs to be on her, not on this amazing thing that I've done. Please don't tell anybody about this. It's really about, don't focus on what I've done. Please focus on her. She's hungry. She needs your care and your attention, which is a good word for us to kind of end on. Ultimately our ministry in the name of Jesus is to tend for those who are struggling, right, and who have gone through some ordeals. And so that's a good word. Next week we get one of the most famous stories in all of the Gospels, the feeding of the 5,000. But your homework for this week is Jesus is going to tell the disciples that if people don't treat them well while they go out on their mission, when they leave, they should kick the dirt off their feet.
Mhm.
I dare you to find a good explanation for what that phrase means. Kick the dirt off the feet. Because there are so many out there and some of them are not good. So I would encourage you to do a little bit of research. I'd love to see what you come up with. What does it mean when Jesus tells his disciples, if you are not found welcome and you leave a village, to kick the dust off your feet when you leave? But it's good to see everybody. Hope you learned something and were inspired tonight. And we'll see you next time. Have a great rest of your week.